here. I was supposed to be in Pune today.
Oh, really?
On a student Pune trip. It was cancelled.
Oh, that's good. Are you going to be going later?
Yeah.
And is Pune a good?
Yeah, an exchange student at Symbiosis.
Yeah, I mean, there's also great universities. Should we get started? Yeah. Well, welcome to this this discussion, and it very much will be a discussion around the publication of a book, a collective volume on comparative constitutionalism in South Asia, which has been a long time coming. The origins of this book go back to a conference we had in 2006, when at that time I was in Washington, which is where Vikram, Raghavan, still is. And it came out of actually conversations he and I had where he had urged me about the importance of this topic. And at that time, it was hard actually to see the importance of the topic. But I think Vikram was absolutely right. And along with Arun and then many other colleagues who figure in the book, we moved ahead with a meeting in 2006 and then I think again in 2009 in Singapore. And so finally the volume has come out. So this is kind of to have a discussion around that. We're very pleased that Gopal Gandhi, who is our visiting Tagore Center fellow, has agreed to preside over the discussion, and I hope may make some comments if he feels like it, but would be here to kind of launch the book. I'm just going to make some very few remarks and then hand over to Vikram, Arun, Mara, and John O'Dowd. We're very lucky to have 4 of the contributors to the volume with us today. So I'll just speak for a few minutes and then pass it over. I mean, it's a continuing, enduring enigma about South Asia. Why a region whose national states share so much in common in terms of language, culture, religions, and popular imagination, share more in common probably than any other region in the world, should also remain the least integrated. Whether you measure that in terms of flows of trade, of people, or of ideas. And it's kind of doubly paradoxical if you think that it's not just the deeper language, culture, religion, and popular imagination, but even the legal systems and the constitutional systems of South Asia possess a remarkable degree of kinship, based, of course, in the inherited colonial British traditions. And yet there seems to be little dialogue between them. And that lack of integration, I think, becomes more and more urgent, particularly in a global economy which is now being defined in terms of regional economic blocs and their relative strength and weakness. And the continuing obstacles to inter-regional exchange in South Asia, I think, are not just now an unsustainable opportunity cost, but really are kind of blocking the economic futures of India and of all who inhabited this most populous region of the world. Obviously, bringing the economies of South Asia will not be easy. It won't happen fast. But I think the critical thing, and that's one of the thoughts behind this book, the critical thing is that it's going to be a task not just for economists and economic policymakers, or indeed even just for political leaders. It'll also need building links across the legal structures and the governance structures present in the region, as occurred, for instance, in Europe, where convergence in legal norms and practices was a precondition for economic integration. And here, actually, there's some quite interesting developments, and I think that's where this book takes off from and hopes to kind of expand the space for discussion. Interesting because if you actually look at the practices the judgments of the courts in the region, and we'll hear more about this from my colleagues. If you start to look at the practice, you see that there is borrowing occurring. You see that there are comparisons and analogies being drawn at the level of court judgments. And that's actually happening quite regularly. I mean, just to take a recent instance, last month, the Pakistan Supreme Court judgment on the prime ministerial corruption, the judgment may have been made for all kinds of intricate reasons which we can go into. But what was interesting about it was that it referred several times to Indian cases and judgments in that judgment, in this very important political judgment in Pakistan, which actually was referring to Indian cases and judgments. Likewise, you'll find this with the Bangladesh court and also with Indian courts that are referring to practices in some of the neighboring jurisdictions. So there is a kind of incipient, emerging constitutional dialogue in the South Asian region. And I think, you know, what this volume wanted to do was to alert us to that, to show the kind of range of different kinds of conversations that are happening or could be happening, and indeed to enlarge that space, so that we start to see South Asia as a kind of emergent and enlarging space of law, shared legal norms and practices, but where the building of that also needs the contributions of the social sciences and history, precisely to register the differences, the particularities, which are so important to designing what might be a convergent legal architecture. And that's also, I think, one of the distinctive things about the volume, that we tried to bring together both legal scholars and experts, but also social scientists, political scientists, and historians to try and develop this conversation about shared constitutional norms, visions, and practices in South Asia. So I'll stop there and hand over perhaps to Vikram or to Arun.
Thanks, Sunil. I'm going to. I live and work in Singapore, where I've been for 7 years, and there's a tendency. Those of you who are familiar with Singapore will know it's known for its planning and its efficiency. One is affected by one's environment, and I think I was in our conversations about how to structure this panel. I wanted to have a lot of planning and work it, but I think Sunil, who's much more in touch with the Indian in him than I am, sort of suggested that we keep it informal and we keep our remarks short, with the idea of getting other people around the table to join in the conversation. So what I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about the book. Sunil's already referred to it, but I think some of you may have seen the book, but I'm assuming that not everyone would have. And it might help you to just get a sense of what this project is about. And I'll do this very quickly. And also perhaps make some comments about the difficulties of doing a project like this. And again, I know several of you around work on issues either in South Asia generally or in individual nations, and we really want to hear you and hear your thoughts on how to take this project forward. And I think Sunil sort of mentioned this, but the idea of doing this event is not so much to celebrate what has been accomplished, and hopefully there is something to celebrate there, but more importantly, more importantly to talk about how we can take this project forward and have new collaborators, new recruits for taking the project forward. So in that spirit, I'll try and make two broad sets of comments. One is about the project. So Sunil's already referred to it a little bit. Let me just tell you a little bit more about how this was sort of conceived. And as I should say, that the last time I was in London was actually for the first of the two conferences that eventually resulted in this book project. And I see several people around the table. Prabha is also here, who is a moderator for that, and this was at SOAS. I'll say a little bit more about the personal element to it, but let me now try and stick to laying out the project as such. So in the introduction, we define, and this may be the subject of some controversy, South Asia to mean 9 countries. Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. We've continued to use the term South Asia, and we talk about South Asian constitutionalism. In the first chapter, Upendra Bakshi laments our choice. He says South Asia is a colonial invention, and he wishes that we had come up with a new post-colonial nomenclature. We've not been able to succeed in that, but hopefully we can talk about even terminology and how to sort of take this forward. The book consists of one introduction, which is written by the three of us jointly, and 11 chapters. So of the 9 jurisdictions that I spoke about, we cover 6 of them. 3 are not covered, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and the Maldives, where, if you've been reading the papers, there are very interesting constitutional developments happening right now. And I guess one of the things of taking the project forward is how do we get people to also cover those areas and talk about them. In terms of the countries covered, this is something the 3 of us are Indian citizens, and we were conscious of this. At the first conference, at the first session, a lot of people commented on the dominance of Indians, and as you can expect, that is something that will come up, and we tried to sort of make this not just about India. In a lot of disciplines, I've seen a lot of books which will have South Asia in the title, and when you look at them, about 60% of it is India, and not so much the others. But we'll talk a little bit about the challenges of trying to get past that. So of the 12 chapters, as many as 7 of them reference India, and India is at least part of the focus, if not the sole focus. 2 chapters cover Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka, each covered at least in 1 chapter. 3 chapters are cross-jurisdictional. They compare at least 2 jurisdictions in South Africa, in South Asia. We would like to think, though, and that our job as editors was to push each of our authors to try and be comparative-minded, even when they are talking about perhaps one jurisdiction. And for me, 2 of the chapters which exemplify that are the chapters by Mara Malagodi, who is speaking about Nepal, and there's a chapter by Richard Whitecross on Bhutan and constitutionalism in Bhutan. And these 2 chapters, I think, cover a wide gap in the literature and explain to us what's happening in these places, but also in terms by which other South Asianists can understand what's happening. And I think they make very good use of the comparative lens to convey their arguments to a broader audience. And I'd like to think that you could say that for most of the other chapters as well. We've tried to take advantage of people's local or national expertise and then make them converse with others. So one of the, I think the good parts of some of the chapters is how they speak to each other and draw contrasts between different South Asian jurisdictions, though perhaps that's still not at a level where we can really talk about comparative constitutionalism in South Asia, and that's one of the challenges of sort of taking this forward. In terms of the background of the scholars, and I think Mara is also going to speak about this, the need for interdisciplinarity. In the latest issue of the International Journal of Constitutional Law, which is one of the leading journals in the field of comparative constitutional law, Ran Herschel, who's a political scientist who I think also has law degrees, makes this argument that comparative constitutional law should move towards becoming comparative constitutional studies. And the idea being that it should not just be about lawyers and it should be much more interdisciplinary. I think the broad point that Herschel makes is something we've tried to take quite seriously in the book, as I will explain, but I do want to say that one of the things that he says, and certainly looking from a South Asian perspective, I thought was overstated. So his point is that constitutional law tends to be only about black letter or doctrinal law, and constitutional lawyers don't pay enough attention to the politics, to the larger social context. I think this critique is a bit overblown. I know of no sophisticated constitutional lawyer who does not pay attention to the larger politics, and I think it's a bit of a straw man. So this book is dedicated to 2 stalwarts, Nilan Thiruchelvan and Upendra Bakshi, and I think others will speak about these people as well. And I think if you look at their work, both of them, though they were constitutional lawyers, have always been attentive to a sort of law and context or law and society approach. So I think certainly people like that don't live up to Herschel's characterization of black letter constitutional lawyers who don't think of the larger social context. So in the volume, there are 14 scholars whose work is represented in this volume. 8 of them are, in Herschel's terms, straight constitutional lawyers who probably don't have disciplinary expertise in other things, but hopefully try and reach out. 3 of the people are 4 people are political scientists who also look at law or sometimes with legal qualifications. And at least 2 people have qualifications both in law and other social sciences. And I think that's something that was very much sort of concerted attempt, and I think that needs to be done more. And to that extent, I think I have sympathy for Herschel's point about interdisciplinarity and the need for that. Those of you who had the benefit of listening to Mr. Gopal Gandhi's lecture yesterday, I actually took a page out of his book in trying to use statistics to tell interesting stories. And the other thing, and I see several of us were in the lecture, and I'll just very briefly talk about that and close. But in the lecture, he urged us to rethink the categories of North and South in the Indian political imagination, but I think the larger point was to think of these geographical categories much more broadly. And in that sense, I thought that was very stimulating, and I'm still, I think like several people around, I'm still trying to process the implications of that and where that will go. But one of the things that you said, and you said that you're aware of the dangers of generalizations, but that you would nevertheless make one, and you said that we associate certain values with the north of India, which you said were emotion and feeling, and certain values we associate with the south, reason, cogitation, and analysis. And so taking a sort of personal tone, as my surname indicates, I'm a Tamilian, but I grew up in the north, and I'd like to think that I don't know if I will be able to reflect the values of cogitation, analysis, and reason. So it's probably easier to try and go into the emotional side. But I will, because I go to that to sort of talk about the challenges of doing a project like this. So as I mentioned, the last time I was here was as a participant in the first conference. The conference was organized by Vikram and Sunil as well. Sorry, you want to say something? Yeah. Werner Mensky's contribution was pretty signal. Alex Fisher as well was involved in that. And several people who presented papers unfortunately could not be part of the project later on. And we organized a second conference in Singapore where again people came, and as we all know, the challenges in South Asia are even more than in other places, where a lot of people who are writing academic works are practicing lawyers and doing all kinds of things at the same time. And then there are people like Mara who didn't formally present at the 2 conferences, but
I was doing my PhD fieldwork.
right, yeah, and are part of the project as well. So it's been a very satisfying process, but it's 6.5 years to sort of put it together. People will drop in and drop out, and then others will join in the journey, and that's been a pretty enlightening sort of experience. So much as we want to talk about this project and take it forward, we have to be alive to several of the factors which act as impediments. So in the introduction, we talk about why this may be so. Those of us who are associated with South Asian academic institutions know the challenges that those institutions face. Domestic scholars have a hard enough time finding funding to do domestic work. To expect them to then also do regional work is difficult at the very least. I think as Vikram and Sunil were very conscious that this project was not located in South Asia. The second conference, I think they made valiant attempts to locate it in some South Asian institution. That didn't work, and we eventually held it in Singapore. So it's odd that London and Singapore seem to be places where South Asianists sort of flourish and are able to come together. I'll probably stop here because I've exceeded my time, but I look forward to the discussion later.
I'll just say one thing. Arun referred to the Indian in me, and perhaps it was too dominant in not introducing our panel, which I should just quickly do in the informality. Arun Thiruvengadam is from the law school in Singapore and has travelled especially for this discussion. Vikram Raghavan is Senior Legal Counsel at the World Bank and also has come across from Washington to be with us. And Mara Malgodi is Postdoctoral Fellow at the LSE. And John O'Dowd is Trinity College Dublin. UCD, I'm sorry, University College Dublin. Vikram, would you like to Mara, why don't you
contribute? Sorry,
okay, sorry.
We're trying to record it, so I want to make sure
I wanted to pick up on Arun's point about the comparative nature of research and how important it's been, especially in my case, looking at a very small Himalayan South Asian state over the years. And also to pick on the second point that Arun made on interdisciplinarity. And I always find myself struggling when I write that, am I writing about constitutional law, constitutional politics, or constitutional history? And I like to think that I combine the three of them. Doing work on Nepal has taught me a great deal about South Asia because I wasn't able to do any work on Nepal unless I was able to look at other jurisdictions. My latest example was yesterday. We had an event with the Bar Human Rights Committee on the impeachment of the Chief Justice in Sri Lanka. And that, of course, got me thinking about what's happening to the Chief Justice in Nepal at this very time. When we have Nepal, there has not been a parliament, a legislature in place since May 2012, when the Constituent Assembly collapsed. We have a small government, which is not receiving particular support at the moment from the opposition parties. And the latest proposal, with the Supreme Court down to 6 justices, because there's no legislature in place, the latest political proposal has been to have the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to lead the new coalition government. Which of course is completely different, seemingly, to the Sri Lankan situation where the Chief Justice has been impeached. But then it gets you thinking about what's the position of the Chief Justice across South Asia and all the different connections that you can make. Why do we look at South Asia to better understand? Well, for me, in my work, the obvious point of reference was constitutional borrowing in constitution-making moments, and of course Nepal has had so many that it's quite an interesting experience to look at the various models in different historical moments. And that's taken me across from 1951, when of course the obvious point of reference was India in the first implemented constitution. Then you go through 1959 and you have a change, and it's this idea of having a modified British Westminster model. And then, of course, I stumble across a footnote on the work of Sir Ivor Jennings, a very noted British constitutionalist in Nepal at the time, who advised the small constitution commission that drafted the document for a month in 1958. And that sparked another project, which was actually even Ivor Jennings had a massive legacy in terms of his South Asia impact, and that's a new project I'm working on with my colleague Arshan Kumar Singham. Stumbling into the archives in London basically got me to consider the fact that Ivor Jennings was first based in Sri Lanka. He was the first dean of the law school in Peradeniya. Then he worked in Pakistan in 54 and 55, first of all as constitutional advisor to the first Constituent Assembly, but that was a very short appointment. Actually, his most substantial contribution was his role as counsel in the litigation over the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly in 55, where he first lost the first case opposing the NPRIT in the Sindh High Court, and then managed to win in the federal court, which is now the Supreme Court, over the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. What was mesmerizing about this, apart from the fact of the heavy involvement of English barristers in that kind of litigation, was also the fact that when he came to Nepal in 1958, the model that he wanted to implement was the Pakistani model. What he said was the Pakistan formula is the one that suits Nepal the best. And of course, he was very critical of the Indian constitution. I always had the suspicion that he didn't perhaps appreciate the extraordinary efforts that document represented and the accomplishment. But it was quite relevant in that regard. And also, having been the legal author of the Doctrine of Necessity and somehow having provided justification for legal coups in South Asia, his legacy is very important, I think, in all of these jurisdictions. To pick up the history, then, of course, the legacy of Ivor Jennings was disastrous in Nepal because the constitution he drafted lasted a bit more than 18 months. And then we had a royal takeover in 1960 and 30 years of monarchical panchayat autocracy. And then again, with the 1962 constitution, the models of reference changed, yet again for Nepal. And the small commission appointed by the king was looking directly at Pakistan in terms of South Asian models. It was also looking at Indonesia, Egypt, and Yugoslavia. Then, of course, we come to 1990, the second moment of redemocratization. And the political outcome is the idea of setting up a constitutional monarchy, of creating a parliamentary democracy. The models shift again, and we go back to the UK. But then that's the obvious reference that you have when I interview constitution makers. What you see is actually a lot of borrowing taking place from India. And that's really the dominant model, which goes unacknowledged. And it's particularly relevant in the changed role of the Supreme Court in Nepal, in terms of the fact that the constitution enshrines public interest litigation exactly has developed jurisprudentially in the Indian context. Then you come to 10 years of civil war in Nepal, and you arrive to 2007, where the interim constitution is drafted and the debates over the Constituent Assembly begins. And then the models change again. India remains, again, the unacknowledged great matrix, I think, for constitution-making efforts. But also in terms of experts, what we had Professor Yashgai that led the consultancy for a number of years. So the models became South Africa, Kenya, to a certain extent Canada. With, of course, India, as I said, remaining the elephant in the room. But I think is quite telling for many other aspects of constitutional politics in Nepal and politics more in general. Also, the idea of judicial activism across South Asia is something which has been borrowed in Pakistan, it's been borrowed in Bangladesh and other jurisdictions. But also, what links to me South Asia is also the constitutional reactions to authoritarianisms. All the countries have experienced that, and I think also the reactions have had a huge impact in the way in which each country deals with different situations. And that really leads me to conclude with a very short consideration about methodology, about the approach that we have. And it goes perhaps to my own training. I used to think of myself primarily as an area studies person. And then, of course, I've been trained as a political scientist originally, and then I switched to law. And it's the idea, how do you combine all of this? And for me, the law and society approach has remained to this day the most fruitful one, because I'm able to combine the specificity of a very detailed case studies analysis, constitutional ethnography, and so on, with more generalizable comparison that you can make through the social sciences. And I think that, for me, has been at the moment I am now in my research and consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. Well, I'd like to thank Sunil and Vikram and Arun first for the tremendous effort they've put together into producing this book over such a long period and gathering such an interesting set of contributions together. I won't make very extensive remarks because I didn't realize I was going to be here until a few days ago, so I didn't have a great deal of time to reflect on what I was going to say. But I might concentrate maybe on my own chapter in the book, which is about freedom of expression in South Asia and some of the common historical and institutional and maybe cultural factors as well that affect that. Arun referred to the fact, and my chapter would fall into this category, I suppose, of a chapter that focuses on one particular jurisdiction, on India really, and has some sideways looks at some of the neighbouring countries in the area, however you define it. And of course, one of the unifying factors there is the historical legacy of the Indian Penal Code, in particular, and the codes of criminal procedure, which remain quite similar, although there are very specific modifications in Myanmar and Pakistan, etc. The rudiments of Macaulay and Stevens' work and the work of those in the 1920s then who had to revise, or felt they had to revise the code, is still very much in evidence. And so that was, I suppose, the comparative framework, which is rather black letter, within which I was working. But what I attempted to do there was to bring to bear a consideration of some of the philosophical premises that the British administrators in the late 19th century, early 20th century themselves used to look at this. It's very interesting, actually, in a different sense. A few weeks ago I was at a seminar in Dublin, and Dr. Paddy O'Leary was presenting on parallels between Amritsar and the Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916. And there were a number of sharp criticisms from the floor, actually, that this was a rather forced parallel, because the British response to what was going on in Amritsar might have looked rather similar to the response to what had happened in Ireland in 1916, but the actual phenomena they were responding to were rather different. So it might be a little bit misleading to draw that comparison, but I think Dr. O'Leary made the very good point that the common factor was the British. It wasn't necessarily the phenomena they were facing, it was the preconceptions or parallels that they saw between the two situations that often conditioned their behaviour. And he made the point, I should say, that a good number of the administrators, Sir Michael O'Dwyer preeminently, in British India were of Irish background and had their own experiences of nationalism and violence and the land question and various other things in Ireland that may have coloured their reactions to what was going on in the UK, in India. But the figure I had in mind particularly was Sir James Fitzstane Stephen, because it's very interesting to reflect on how his response to John Stuart Mill was coloured very much by his experience of India, and he draws on Indian examples to say, well, Mill is looking at liberty of thought and discussion and liberty generally from a very culturally specific perspective. And if one transfers what he has to say about human behaviour and the perfection of human beings in different social milieu, I suppose, it simply doesn't work in a society like India. And the British administrators, this is the origin of the title about Pilate's predicament. He compares Pontius Pilate to a political officer on the northwest frontier, perhaps, who has to deal with an unruly religious leader and the implications for public order. So that broadly, the legacy of the British legislative nachlass in South Asia, I suppose you could say, and the way in which it related to James Fitzstane Stephen's thought on these philosophical issues more broadly were the things that tie my chapter together, I suppose, and provide a little bit more than just a national survey. But a thing I didn't really get a chance to develop, and well, the other thing I'll mention briefly is I did attempt to suggest, and I know some of the other commentators as well, point to some of the lessons that could be learned from the European context, and specifically, I wasn't thinking of the European Union, but rather of the European Convention on Human Rights and some of the case law of the European Court of Human Rights that does. One of the points I was making in the article is the European Court of Human Rights in some ways is closer to Stephen than it is to Mill in the way it deals with religiously offensive or religiously inflammatory expression, for example, in terms of where, at least theoretically, it draws the outer limits. But something I didn't get a chance to develop in the chapter, and perhaps it relates to one of the points that Arun made, is one of the things I do mention briefly in the chapter, and it's perhaps possibly a basis for future work, is this whole question of censorship outside the formal bounds of the law, because there's a great deal of censorship through the threat of the censorship by the mob, basically, I suppose, if one wants to summarise it, either in terms of direct action, in terms of intimidation, or in terms of state governments simply caving in to powerful, vociferous pressure groups, and, for example, issuing prohibition orders that they know are not going to stand up in the High Court, but it takes 3 or 4 years for the High Court to determine that this was just a short-term political. And, you know, since the chapter was completed, Tasneem and Nasreen has had further problems, there's Salman Rushdie and his travails in the last 12 months. And I was also thinking more broadly as well of this whole role of popular intervention in constitutional politics. Sana Hazare's movement, the events that are happening right now in Bangladesh, of course, over the War Crimes Tribunal, and we saw it in the Indian rape protests as well, which from an outside point of view looks rather strange to have a mass movement demanding the imposition of the death penalty, but that's an issue that has to be looked at rather more subtly than an initial reaction. So I think in terms of further work in the area I was looking at, yes, the chapter I contributed was very much about freedom of expression, but I think probably the larger project is about this whole question of the culture of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, and this question of mass intolerance, or certainly mobilized intolerance anyway, being brought to bear to set limits which are much narrower than the limits that appear to be on the face of it, the boundaries that the Indian constitution and Indian law sets to freedom of expression. And I don't think I need to labour the point that that problem is even worse in some of the other countries in South Asia. The whole cycle of blasphemy panics in Pakistan, I suppose, being the most notorious, but not the most profound example, perhaps. So I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Sunil, for that generous introduction, and thank you for John and Mara for being here at short notice. I know that we had to put this together quite quickly. I guess your introductory words were perfect, except for that reference, Sunil, to senior legal counsel. It's not a title, senior, that I easily bear, not merely because there are often more senior people in the room, but it also adds an air of distinction that I don't particularly believe I have. But I also wanted to make a statutory caveat that, as I often make at these occasions, and Arun gets tired, is that I'm speaking here in my personal capacity and not as a staff member of the institution I work for. I thought I would focus very briefly in this sort of, keeping the informality of this occasion, on what South Asian constitutionalism actually means for the people of South Asia. I think that's what Neelan would have wanted us to focus on, one of the people we dedicate this book. And it's not just about Supreme Court judges networking and citing each other across the region, or free market advocates like at the institution I work, who envision greater South Asian unity through commercial and economic or trade means, and they think of all the political and cultural tensions will somehow disappear. Because it's interesting that the cause of a more integrated South Asia has actually been championed by many left-wing and progressive activists over time, which I think often is often forgotten. And it's actually, I think in that sense, Neelan who really explored the analytical and practical underpinnings of what a more closely connected South Asia would look like to a lawyer or to a scholar who had a vision of creating a sort of constitutional utopia that would, in some sense, bring together these disparate countries, although who share a great common heritage, and to sort of give effect to this vision, Neelan really set up two important, and I think somewhat unacknowledged, especially in the West, but even in South Asia, institutions in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, the International Center for Ethnic Studies, which was headed for many years by Radhika Kumaraswamy, and the Law and Society Trust, which I had the good fortune to intern at, and several of my colleagues followed me from my former alma mater. And these two centers really became important fora for human rights research and activism at a time when in the whole region there was not much happening. These institutions welcome scholars and activists from around the world, but especially from within South Asia, to exchange ideas, debates, strategies, and basically be sounding boards for each other. And it's really Neelan's vision that made this happen, because he was not only deeply concerned about human rights in his own country, but also in the region. I remember him very passionately arguing the case of Aung San Suu Kyi to Radhika, who just become the UN Special Rapporteur on violence against women, its causes and its consequences. And then he went on to sponsor a resolution in the Sri Lankan Parliament for Aung San Suu Kyi. He was also concerned about the rights of indigenous peoples in the region, especially the Chakma refugees of Bangladesh, very upset about military rule. In fact, while I was working for him, he invited Benazir Bhutto on, as a sabbatical to the center. And then also women's rights in Afghanistan. He narrates this incident of how Radhika goes to Afghanistan and the Taliban foreign minister talks to her facing, with her back facing, and he said, well, you should have, walked around. So in some sense, the reason I dwell on his vision is really he was a true first South Asian that I can conceive of. If we ever have to invent, which point I'll come to, an idea of the honorary South Asian citizen, I think he would be among the first in line. And he was also, behind one of the early attempts to set up a South Asian non-governmental elections monitoring mechanism, with former Prime Minister I.K. Gujral was involved with as well. Initiative which has had its ups and downs over the past years, but it's again something whose relevance I think is still very important. And so let's ask this rhetorical question about what Neelan would have wanted in terms of what do you do to carry forward his vision of a more closer South Asia, a closer union of these peoples, which this inevitably leads us to this notion, which is often bandied about, of people-to-people contact. And I think it's always a pleasant but ambiguous term, because it's notoriously hard to define. Does it mean more joint cricket matches across the Wagah border, perhaps more Sri Lankan tourists visiting the Buddhist shrines in Bihar, or more Indians in Bhutan, especially since they don't have to pay the $250 admission charge, and more buses across the LOC, ferries across the park straits, and more flights within the region. This is the region of all the regions of the world that is least connected internally, even less than sub-Saharan Africa. Yes, all this is welcome, especially in a region with enormous untapped economic and trade potential. Intra-South Asian trade, net exports and imports is the lowest among the world's 6 main regions, and it's actually cheaper to trade outside the region than inside. But I do think people-to-people contact also means deeper and more profound links than just cultural or economic integration. And the first type of such, again, deeper people-to-people contacts are already taking place, what we've discussed, and they involve this much maligned but rather blighted special group of people whom I'm especially sympathetic to because I belong to that tribe, the lawyers. And lawyers across South Asia, as Mara has mentioned, are networking like never before. And in this respect, special mention must be mentioned of SARC law, which is also which was founded about 20 years ago by leading lawyers from the various Supreme Courts and High Courts in the region. I should mention the name of K.K. Venugopal, who was really the person who had the sort of foresight to found this institution, has really put his money behind this cause, and also shepherd many of his counterparts to do so. I recall meeting many Pakistan judges for the first time in his chambers, and he really pushed this idea of creating a fraternity across South Asian boundaries of appellate lawyers. And in recent years, Venugopal has helped endow and establish the M.K. Nambiar SARC Law Center in honor of his father, who was a famous constitutional lawyer, in Hyderabad. And I find it somewhat of an underutilized but state-of-the-art legal research unit, which is really dedicated to further research and study of South Asian constitutional and legal integration. Incidentally, I should point out that before his premature demise, one of Neelan's ideas, which people had somewhat of a wild-eyed reaction to, was to actually start a South Asian law firm. And so in the last letterhead he designed shortly before his death, at the bottom of the page he had who he thought were his future South Asian law partners. He had Kamal Hussain, he had Justice Bhagwati, and I think he had Asma Jahangir as his vision of a South Asian law firm, which he called Thiruvengadam and Associates. Anyway, so besides this bonding of appellate and transactional or constitutional lawyers, I think there is also a substantial convergence across the activists in various fields in this region. Again, completely undocumented, not well studied, but tremendous amount of under-the-radar activity. Just to give you an example, when the Delhi High Court issued its decision in the 377 Nas decision, I found out about it by an email from my friend Sarah Hussain, human rights activist in Bangladesh, who forwarded me a link from a Sri Lankan news listserv announcing the decision. And so it's quite interesting to see how at the activist level, or even the not necessarily at the appellate lawyer level, but even the working lawyer level, there's a lot of interesting bonds and linkages across the region like never before. To give one sort of more example, which is a little more outside the law, is in the November issue of the EPW, the Economic and Political Weekly, there's this interesting report about how Indian microfinance practitioners are now drawing lessons from their Bangladesh counterparts on how do we restructure our microfinance systems, especially after the crash in Andhra Pradesh. In Bangladesh, apparently, MFIs hold compulsory savings from clients, and if a client gets into difficulties, these savings provide a buffer to manage potential defaults. And drawing upon this example, Indian MFIs are now trying to convince the Indian Reserve Bank to change its policy of not allowing MFIs to hold investor savings. And they especially cite the Bangladesh example. So you'll see this osmosis is taking place not just among lawyers or legal scholars, but also among activists or practitioners, and in ways that I think behoove for further documentation and study. There are NGOs and civil society groups increasingly forming cross-border structural alliances. I should just quickly mention the South-South exchange of research and education networks, the South Asia Network of Self-Employed Women, very important, interesting sort of sharing of exchanges in the livelihoods and women empowerment in rural areas context. Now, some of these, of course, are donor-driven, to be completely, upfront about it, but they are also developing to local roots and beginning to stick, especially among these communities. Now, a fourth unstudied but unmistakable trend is the growing policy and regulatory convergence across the region, which again is taking place really outside, the radar screen of a lot of academia, which studies political integration, and that involves national regulators and policymakers, whether those controlling telecoms, securities, competition. All of them are now forming informal networks where they consult and exchange ideas with their peers in the region. There is also now an emerging fraternity among central banks and supreme audit institutions. All the CAGs of the regions are now regularly meeting. And while many of these exchanges continue to be networking jamborees, there are slowly emerging memoranda of understanding, joint harmonization protocols, and in some cases, even common standards being promulgated. But there are inherent limits on how much this sort of informal, in some sense, loose integration can go, how far you can go. Assuming, of course, this is a desirable normative goal to sort of, integrate, and because, this also then creates other problems like isomorphism and path dependence, which we then end up critiquing because, we follow models. But if this is a desirable goal, then a formal institutional framework may be necessary to achieve more sustainable harmonization in the long run. In South Asia, we already have such an enabling framework, which is in the form of SARC, the South Asian Regional Association for Regional Cooperation, which is now 26 years old. However, as most of us in this room know, SARC's achievements have really been disappointing, largely held hostage to the political tensions among its members. But even there's some hope for, opportunity and progress. There's very interesting new South Asian Development Forum based in Bhutan, looking to see how SARC can act as a development catalyst. And I've always said if countries like India want to found the BRICS Bank, then you could always support something like the South Asian Development Forum, because the other thing that this region lacks is a regional development bank, like the African Development Bank. Now, but let us return finally to this whole issue of how all this benefits the Aam Aadmi. And as I see it, it's not just about the citizens of Dhaka being able to buy, the choice Sri Lankan teas, or Fab India locating and adding to one more of Lahore's, chic ethnic boutiques. But it's really about, I think regional impact can really make a deeper there can be a deeper impact if the people of these countries assume a common South Asian identity, the notion of a shared or common citizenship. And that's not hard to conceive, especially, on this continent, or are we on this continent? I don't know. This is the debate, right, in this country, of the European experience of incrementally developing a distinct EU citizen identity. And it's not impractical to think about this. After all, most South Asians outside South Asia form implicitly common cultural sort of bonds with each other because of their shared ethnic and cultural ties. But we have to take that back to the people in South Asia. And I think that was really Neelan's vision. And I really think that that's really where he would have liked us to try and sort of formulate a framework by which people of South Asia see themselves as citizens of their own country, but also of a larger region to which they belong.
Well, I must thank Sunil for giving me this unexpected bonus of participating in this gathering, and congratulate him and Vikram and Arun on this book. I see the book as part of the volume of constitutional studies, which started not after the Constitution of India, but even before the Constitution of India became a draft, not to speak of a document which was passed by the Constituent Assembly. B.N. Rao, who assisted the chairman of the drafting committee, brought a very judicious mind, apart from a juridical mind, to the tasks of the drafting committee. And by coincidence, his brother Shivarao gave us this monumental work of analysis and documentation on the process of the evolution of the Constitution of India. Now, those two brothers, in a sense, can be described as first commentators on the Constitution of India, and quickly followed by Durgadas Gupta of Calcutta and Sirvai of Bombay, who have given us extraordinary commentaries on the Constitution of India. There is no Constitution of India without the analyses of Durgadas Bhushan and Sirvai. Now, they are constitutional studies, and that process continues. The process must continue beyond studies to an awareness, and that also is happening thanks to these two. I cannot imagine a situation when the Constitution of India was seen as a document that has emerged from the labors of the honest for the benefit of the innocent. That's how it was first looked at. Constitution of India has been made by a group of very honest and diligent people for an extremely law-abiding and innocent population of India. Now, that has certainly changed. The first amendment to the Constitution of India took place within a year, and with the same members of the Constituent Assembly now meeting in the Provisional Parliament. And now we have got more than 100 amendments. Am I right? I think the fact that there have been so many amendments to the Constitution of India and so many studies of the Constitution of India ensures in a way the health of the Constitution and the strength of all that the Constitution of India provides. Had the Constitution of India indeed been what Ivor Jennings described it to be, namely rigid and prolix, but it is rather long, but I can't say it's prolix. It was a very left-handed compliment, which he incidentally paid in a meeting in Madras, 1951. Had it been like that, it probably would have been toppled. But it is because it was what it was. It was so clear that it could be amended that it has stood the test of time. There was this person called Acharya Kripalani, an extraordinary Indian politician, a front ranker who never became minister or governor or anything like that. And he lived to late 90s, and towards the end of his life he was told, Acharya Kripalani, you seem very fit for your age. You have a good, strong constitution. He said, no, it's all amendments. So, our constitution is something like that. It's because of the fact that it has been able to self-correct that it is where it is. Now, we know what has happened in Colombo. We know the travails of constitution in Nepal. But today, if the people of India have a faith and confidence in the constitutional authorities of India, as opposed to the elected representatives, which is an anomaly, much to be said for the fact that the Constitution has grown into the people of India, and the people, through their own imagination and the evolution of their imagination, have factored their thoughts into the processes of constitutional amendment. I just now conclude by this one somber reflection. That is, that constitutional studies require not just intellectual courage, but actually a great deal of political courage. And Neelan's own life shows that he was walking on the razor's edge and walked to its very end. That is a very sobering thought. And I would like to say that studies of the working of constitutions are not just about the the nuances and the delicacies of drafting an ideal document for the governance of a country lawfully, but very often taking foursquare issues of life and death and survival in this extremely disparate and unquiet part of the world.
Thank you so much, Gopal. I think we should now open that up for discussion, contributions, thoughts around these subjects. So if you could just give your name and affiliation if appropriate, that would be helpful.
Can I? Just looking at the sort of constitutional history of countries in South Asia, it seems to me that perhaps the good thing about the Indian constitution was not just that it was written in elaboration discussion, but the sheer fact that India somehow managed to get it right in the first attempt. And the fact that a number of the other countries had to have multiple sort of assaults before they could come to a set of constitution, which still sort of set aside in the country, Pakistan, seems to me to be historically a very important thing. And I was wondering if that, because again, I looked at some comparative data, the chances of getting a constitution which lasts is not very long if you go into sort of multiple iterations of the Constituent Assembly. And I was wondering, how much of that really is borne out by the South Asian experience as well, which is that it's not about the fact that India sort of had this constitution which had these strange ideas, but the sheer fact that you got it right in the first attempt and it stuck, whereas it didn't in a number of other cases.
Well, I'm not sure I agree that India got it right on the first attempt, partly because of what Gopal just mentioned, the never-ending amendments. In fact, the whole controversy which Nambiar made his name, after whom the Stark Law Center is, was whether the constitution the ink had barely gone dry, you could preventively detain people, a point which is still an enduring constitutional controversy, but they had to quickly amend this, beautiful piece that they had just drafted in a year to make all kinds of changes, including on free speech as well as on preventive detention. And then, of course, we had things like the 42nd Amendment, which substantially rewrote several parts of the Constitution. Of course, some of them were corrected in the 44th Amendment after Mrs. Gandhi was voted out of power. But I think that, to use Neelan's phrase, there's been a making and unmaking of constitutions in India. It's a beautiful phrase he invented for Sri Lanka, because they went through their own, almost four constitutions, and each of them for their own. They tried this model, and then they tried some other model, and then they landed this Gaullist model that they have. And I think similar things happened in Pakistan as well as in Bangladesh and in Nepal. But I think the Indian basic structure, if you will, survived. But there's been a lot of change. I mean, even the whole 73rd and 74th Amendments in India is a huge constitutional transformation. In some sense, it's an ultimate victory for the Gandhians in the Constituent Assembly, who kept saying we should have, a Gandhian constitution and a sort of a panchayat republic. But and then there were the Raos and the Ivor Jennings trained Indian black letter lawyers said, no, are they crazy? And Ambedkar had some sympathy for that view. But I think that we now have this whole idea of decentralization and devolution, and in some sense that's a return to what the stone that the founders rejected. And so I think that even within India there's always and that has to be a sort of rethink and a recalibration of what constitutional arrangements best make sense, without, of course, disturbing the basic core.
I'm proud to work in government. And Sunil mentioned in his introduction the importance of a legal framework for regional economic development, which touched on Europe. And in Europe, one of the things that's been very interesting in the last two generations is, for the first time, we've had a degree of supranational legal jurisdiction, the European Court of Justice, and the Human Rights of the European Court of Justice. What you talk about this morning is increasing cooperation bottom up between the jurisprudences of the different parts of Asia and the judicial recognition, perhaps.
analogy to pick, I recall a very interesting paper that a Canadian scholar who works at a US law school gave to us in Dublin a few years ago, where she pointed out there's hardly any supranational structure in North America. There's NAFTA, but it's entirely traditional, almost entirely traditional international, free trade agreement. But there are hundreds of committees in which Canadian and US public servants, regulators, and others are working behind the scenes in this or Mexico, because the United States is not going to enter into a supranational regional union in which it gives governmental powers to international courts or an international commission or sets up a parliament of North America, for example. But within different regions have different regional integration paths, I think, and maybe the European one is a sort of a false analogy for South Asians to take as their inevitable point of reference.
Was that on this point particular?
Sorry?
On this particular point about supranational? I just wanted to...
Yeah, I just had a footnote. Is that, my professor, Joseph Weiler, who's Arun's professor too, who's now the new head of the European University in Italy, always loved the idea that the European Constitution began with the phrase, His Majesty the King of the Belgians, rather than we the people, because it was a treaty masquerading as a constitution. So we've not, all of these supranational, including the European, models have really been treaties between plenipotentiaries, high contracting parties, rather than, a we the people sort of pact. That has happened, but not, again, through a treaty arrangement, rather than a, sui generis, from international law from below, to use Gopalkrishna and Raghavan's phrase.
So I just wanted to go back to this idea of using South Asia as a unit for constitution study and try and explore that a little bit. So while I agree with you, Vikram, that of course there needs to be greater contact generally, structurally, and people and so on. As a person working with constitutional law and comparative constitutional law, I find a very personal complexity in this area, which is that if we look at the practicalities of constitutional law, and I'll generalize the democracy, perhaps there are issues which are purely national issues. And to take an Indian example, for example, with the constitution, with regard to the federal structure and questions to do with that and interstate taxation, for example, very national issue decided on the basis of a very established jurisprudence that exists. On the other hand, the big issue is also with regard to rights issues. And as far as fundamental rights issues are concerned, looking at putting South Asia as a focus seems maybe a double-edged sword. And one is it may cut against this idea of a universal human rights discourse. And so if you're looking at rights cases, perhaps natural basis to look at would also be, and I'm not saying these are mutually exclusive categories, but would also be very much the European Convention, South Africa, the Canadian Charter, and so on. And certain other rights-based issues where you're talking about restrictions, say for example, free speech, say public order, decency, morality, and how the courts are going to judge these issues, where you can say cultural, local, South Asian factors may be very relevant. Now, even in those sorts of issues, I'm not entirely clear as to whether it would be either workable or be even desirable in certain instances to import ideas of public order, decency, and morality from between different countries. So this idea. So I'd like to see how you think in the practical operation of constitutional law in the courts, how you think this idea of South Asia can be used.
Thanks, Arun. And I think that's a good question, and we deal with it in the introduction again in terms of what is the purpose of this kind of study. And we go into debates about comparative law, and these are old debates about why are you doing this? Are you doing it in functionalist terms, which is what you're saying? What's the practical consequence of it? Are you trying to transplant laws? And I think we've tried to say that we don't have that kind of agenda. We're trying, and this is mirroring debates in comparative law more generally. And so you refer to, is there a universalist objective? It isn't, but I think I'd go back to what Mara said, and if great advantage of a comparative lens is, I think, so as she said, you talk about the Chief Justice in Sri Lanka and what's happening to her. If you're a South Asianist, you inevitably look at structures in other places. And you think, now, in some cases, you might actually find very practical things by looking at another system which is very similar to yours, and you might come up with a functionalist sort of justification, do this, do that. But I think that's not necessarily the point. I mean, if you look at contemporary developments, it's been referenced to that. So what's happening in Bangladesh, what's happening in India, that is John's point. So why is this clamoring for the death penalty? And you probably are right, and there are perhaps particular local reasons for it. But it makes sense to look at something which is just around the corner in some ways, and what's causing it there. And maybe then it's not again to come up with a, do X, Y, Z, but just to reflect on that a bit more. And in his chapter in the book, Sujit Chowdhury talks about the importance of dialogical reasoning. And Gary Jacobson and Shaila Sri Shankar basically show how the Sri Lankan courts have used cases from India, not for emulation, but as a way of putting forward their own national identity, which is different from Indian secularism. So in that sense, it's not necessarily, this kind of comparative reflection, I think, reveals a lot, and it's just to use that in. Not sure I'm answering your question, but if you're interested in these phenomena over the long term, I think that's why there's been a turn against that functionalist thinking, that we only look at it if we can see something that you can practically use. I think it tells us something much more deep and significant about the law and how politics plays out, to look at things like that in what are comparable contexts.
I'm looking forward to reading the book, but I was wondering whether there is something to be said for the contradictory place of capital and sovereignty in South Asia. So that when there is no agreement on what relationship or what form of capital that will exist within South Asia, that how could you have legal unity? Where that's what I think EU is a successful, it's a successful legal unit, no matter what the instrument is, because there is an agreement about this relationship to capital. And on the other hand, sovereignty in South Asia is a very charged concept. It's rather new, and therefore, and both capital and sovereignty are intimately connected to both. So unless we can come to an agreement or sort of develop a relationship of consonance with each other, I'm not sure whether this comparison could be, how feasible this comparison is. Because it then runs into questions of practicalities and goodwill and people to people, which are actually, we don't need comparative constitutional law for that. That can carry on regardless. So sorry for the answer, and then I think instead of supranational, could we think of the transnational as a point of reference for South Asia?
Yeah, thanks. I guess it follows up to Olgo's comment as well. And I think we're not agreed on this. I think it was Vikram's point in the introduction was also to talk about the economic factors and the fact that some people might want to think of unity. But I don't think on the legal sphere anyone's talking of legal unity yet. Maybe good reasons for not sort of thinking of that. But just going back to what I think, sort of following up on what I just said to Olgo, if you want to understand, so the traditional way in which comparative law, comparativism works in South Asia is each country looks to the West and itself. That's how you would define it. In Sri Lanka, there's a long tradition of people talking about the West and how Western democracy is working. But nobody looks in the region at places where there are also foreign models working and have been used. And maybe even on capital and sovereignty, instead of comparing how these forms take place in particular South Asian jurisdictions and the West, if we start looking across the region, that might give us a much better understanding of how these phenomena play out. And I think that's much more of our project, rather than arguing for legal unity or supranationalism. It's just greater insight into law and how it plays out, and politics, and perhaps sort of getting that. So I guess I'm disavowing any sort of legal unity goal in that sense, but at least that's been my position. And sorry, the transnational, I think that's very much exactly what I'm trying to argue for rather than supranational.
Yeah, really interested in the interactions that you've had with Sri Lanka and other countries. And my question, a lot of interesting questions arising out of this. My name is William Crawley. I used to be at the BBC, working in the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and recently had the privilege of working with a very distinguished lawyer at the Law and Society Trust in Colombo on issues of media reform in Sri Lanka in particular. My question really for John perhaps is this, that you can look back at the similarities that the common inheritance of constitutional law in many of the South Asian countries have originally taken and adapted or abandoned in their own ways. Yet one looks at individual countries, and India is always Indian institutions, Indian scholars always keen to say there's no comparison really with the smaller countries around India because we are special and we're much bigger anyway. In Sri Lanka they say, well, there's no the superficial comparisons to be made, but there's no real comparison to be made with India because the particularities of Sri Lanka are special. And one issue on that, I think, which is touched on in a new book by Harshan Kumarasangam, comparing the Eastminster, so-called Eastminster constitutions based on a Westminster model, the Eastminster variants of the Westminster model. That a big difference there, that Sri Lanka was, where it might have done some good earlier, was very, very much opposed to the idea of federalism of any kind. India, too, very much in the Constituent Assembly, and Nehru himself, very much in favour of a centralised state, but insistent on calling it a union rather than a union with federal characteristics. I think this was a sort of scholarly dispute at the time. The point about that is interesting is that India has been able to adapt the federal constitution to allow not only for differences, changes in the way in which human rights and other issues are managed, but also in the way in which the whole country is managed. I mean, the fact that the state's reorganization along linguistic grounds in 1956 just created whole new units, with no possibility or argument that there might be a need for agreement among these units, that they should be carved up. And the process has been happening throughout India's constitution, throughout India's existence. But the question I'd like to ask really is, arising from my experience of trying to study media law, these are issues which affect the changes that are needed in media and freedom of expression, the rights that need to be protected, the ways in which they need to be protected, or the way in which public interest needs to be protected, are global issues now. They are the same problems that face India or Sri Lanka or Britain or America or anyone. And so the whole sort of framework of discussion gets involved in a global framework at the same time that you have this common framework of law. And I wonder which you think is more important, the common framework or the very new influences which are shaping policy around the world now, including in South Asia?
I think there's probably a distinction, because certainly in terms of national constitutional law, there is a bit of fetishizing of differences between the different constitutional systems. And I think one of the things in my chapter was, while looking at Indian constitutional law to some extent, I tried to get down a bit to the level of the penal code, the code of criminal procedure, and also the whole question of how law is administered on a day-to-day level. Because if you go down below the level of the national constitutions, I think, and the constitutional rhetoric from politicians and Supreme Courts and others about the state of freedom of expression, if you look at the actual operation of law and the fact that a lot of the legislation is still an imperial inheritance being administered in ways that show some continuity with imperial administration in these different countries, I think you see better some of the common factors. I mean, picking up your point about the form of the constitution, of course, India started off, as you say, as quite a centralized state, and rather like Canada, it's developed into this highly decentralized polycentric political system where the states and their representatives in the national legislature are real players in terms of the dynamic of federal politics. It's a good example if I've got to put the politics in, because Australia, which seems to have a constitution that gives great scope to the states, is in fact a much more centralised political system now, in which even the existence of the states is periodically called into question by some. It's not a live issue anymore, but there was a time when the Australian Labour Party just wanted to abolish the states and turn Australia into a unitary country. So it's true. I think maybe it's this kind of fetishising of the differences between national constitutional law are actually the obstacle to people being open to these global influences and common predicaments you talk about. Because if you go from city to country, for example, and you go from national to local, and you also factor in certain class and caste elements, there's a lot more commonality in some of the issues that are being faced on the ground that do relate in a common way to these global concerns. If you can just see past some of the national sort of constitutional traditions and constitutional shibboleths that are dear to people in particular jurisdictions. That would be my answer.
I wanted to add something on the comment about the Eastminsters. And I think that's a brilliant example of the relationship between structure and agency and how that works when it is combined. And also about how legal models travel in constitutional terms. What you have is not just a transplant, you have an adaptation. And in terms of, if I go back to the example of Ivor Jennings, the reason why he was hired in Nepal was because it was known what kind of constitution he would have delivered, because of the experience he had in Pakistan. And that's why the king has been chasing him for 2 years. And there is FCO correspondence that supports that argument. In that sense, it's not just the idea that the Westminster model traveled, but it was adapted. And I think Arshan's view of the Eastminster is brilliant, especially in the area of constitutional conventions, which is a form of customary law that seems to work only here.
We'll just take one more.
Sorry, I don't really have a question but a comment.
Okay.
Well, I really like the idea of, I'm looking forward to reading the book, and I like the idea of this comparative constitutionalism across South Asia. I've done a bit of research on anti-conversion laws, and I found it really striking how this, both legally and in terms of norms, how much it's quite widespread across South Asia, not just, in the Indian context, it's state-based, so it's only 6 or 7 states, but across South Asia there's an anti-conversion sentiment, so it's a kind of commonality. I think that it argues for, I suppose, that comparative book. So yeah, thank you for.
John Mansfield's chapter compares anti-conversion in Pakistan and India, and they're actually, not surprisingly, law and religion. There are 5 chapters out of the 12 which deal with law and religion in South Asia.
And Deepika.
Yeah.
Deepika.
Starting back to one statement, it seems to be quite clear that what you're doing here is not to de-characterize legal sort of scriptures within the nation state, but trying to add kind of a media spirit in looking at South Asia. I added that media spirit in looking at perhaps using legal scripts to introduce common political debates between countries. Right? So it's not just contests, but also similarities underpinning that context. Looking at these things, I was just wondering how to take this project forward. In terms of, I was just wondering what does part 2 look like? Is it looking at particular cases of commonality or dissimilarity? Is it looking at things like, say, it would be quite interesting, for instance, for us to read about common aspects to treating foreign water, or common aspects when it comes to proliferation. I mean, I'm looking at the international scale, but so in terms of this idea, so what does volume 2 look like?
Well, I think that's a great question for us to end on, because we are starting to think. I mean, I think one area which it really bears a lot more work is something that Vikram mentioned, which is the emergence of these regulatory authorities and structures. And I think that's clearly going to be an expanding field in terms of each of the national jurisdictions. But to see how there might be some kind of more explicit discussion and study of how these are working, I think that's one area where there could be really interesting work done. But I defer to the real movers of the book to say about how they think they might move it forward, and then we'll wind up.
Well, that was actually the question which we thought all of you would be pitching in and sort of, lending support, probably taking it forward in different ways. So I'm not sure, but I will say, and Jennings has been mentioned a couple of times, and one of the interesting things for me was to see, so Jennings is famous for his critique of the Indian Constitution, that it has a Bill of Rights. What is lesser known, I think, extending the ideas beyond South Asia to Southeast Asia, where Jennings becomes a part of the Reid Commission, and then becomes pretty instrumental in developing the constitutions of contemporary Malaysia and Singapore. And towards the end of his life, he changed his view about the value of a Bill of Rights. And if you look at the Malaysian and Singapore constitutions, they have the same, in many ways, very similar Bills of Rights to the Indian Constitution. And so, just before I left Singapore, there's a litigation going on before the Singapore courts, challenging 377A, which is a different version of the anti-sodomy statute that we have in 377. And the way they are challenging it is using the same rights provisions that you find in India. And activists who are working on that turned to me to say, what's happening to this Nas Foundation case? And I said, activists in India are not entirely sure that the Supreme Court will come out in their favor, and that might be expected any time. So they're trying to speed up the case there so that the Supreme Court of India doesn't reverse the High Court. And they can use that in that way. So what's this got to do with South Asia? I think, again, going back to Herschel's point about lawyers dominate and too much emphasis played on black letter law, to me this is an example of where that black letter law, when it is put in a constitution, gets a life of its own. And that's something which can control how issues play out. And maybe that's something people should be aware of and pay attention to, because that's where the black letter law really has an impact on the way it follows. So I'm not sure it responds to your question, but just to, it's going to be hard to do this for lawyers alone, and we need sort of other people to sort of sign on to the project, and then maybe alert us to issues which we are clearly not looking at. I mean, this is a very, we found people who were interested in issues and they came on board, but this is not really the best way to do a project. We should probably look at what are the issues in South Asia, then look to people who can write about that and compare, and then be able to do that. So that's hopefully what others will also join.
John, Mara, and Vikram, one sentence on how to move it forward. Mara, just one sentence.
No, it's too long. I can't do it in a sentence.
I mean, okay. Well, I think that this is something that we hope all of those of you who are interested in this will help us think through about how one moves it forward. I think one of the difficulties Arun mentioned in his opening remarks, it has been difficult to actually get people in the region to work on these comparative questions, and I think partly one of the tasks will be to encourage younger scholars to do that, and hopefully to be able to have such meetings in the region. When we have tried, we've faced questions of visas and travel and a whole number of different issues, but we hope that we can at least get that practical dimension to help define, to bring people together to help define an agenda for future research. But thanks very much, and thank you, Gopal, for having launched this book for us here in London. Big privilege, thank you.
You must know Kishali into Tagore.
No, I don't.
You don't
All
know?
I know.
She's deputy director.
Oh, yes, no, I have my list with them.
Enjoy.
All of that.